You're not just denied access, you're trespassing." The words didn't echo, they sliced, clean and deliberate, cutting straight through the quiet prestige of Silver Ridge Golf Club at exactly 9:12 a.m., where the air usually smelled of freshly cut grass, polished oak, and old money that never had to announce itself, and for a brief second, everything paused, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for nearby conversations to thin into silence as heads turned with polite curiosity masked as indifference, because scenes like this weren't supposed to happen here, not on a Wednesday morning with tea times booked weeks in advance and luxury SUVs lined up in perfect symmetry along the circular drive, but standing there at the entrance to the private clubhouse, under a stone arch engraved with a crest older than most of its members, was Darius Cole, 29 years old, 6'2", dressed in a plain charcoal polo, tailored but unbranded slacks, and clean white golf shoes that had seen more boardrooms than fairways, and if you didn't know who he was, and no one there thought they did, you might have mistaken him for a late delivery, a caddy running behind schedule, or someone who had taken a wrong turn off the highway and ended up in the wrong world entirely, because everything about Silver Ridge was built to quietly filter people out before they even reached the front door, and today, that system had found its target, the man who had just spoken, Gregory Haynes, head of member services, mid-50s, pressed blazer, silver watch catching the morning light, stood with a posture that suggested both authority and impatience, like he'd handled situations like this before and expected this one to resolve the same way, quickly and without complication. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the VIP entrance," he added, his tone measured but firm, the kind that left no room for interpretation, and Darius didn't move, not immediately, not reactively, just stood there with a stillness that felt out of place in a moment designed to push him out, his eyes scanning the etched names on the brass plaque beside the door, names that meant everything inside these gates and nothing outside them, and then, calmly, almost casually, he said, "Check the list again." It wasn't loud, it wasn't confrontational, but it landed differently than expected, like it didn't belong to someone being turned away, and Gregory's expression tightened just slightly, the smallest crack in an otherwise polished demeanor. "We already did," he replied, gesturing toward the reception desk just inside where a young attendant pretended not to be watching. "You're not on the VIP registry." Around them, the subtle choreography of privilege continued. Men in pastel polos walked past without breaking stride, a woman in oversized sunglasses sipped from a stainless tumbler, glancing once before looking away, because acknowledging moments like this meant disrupting the illusion that everything here worked exactly as it should, but not everyone looked away. A younger golfer, maybe early 30s, phone already halfway raised before he even realized it, lingered near the steps, curiosity outweighing discretion, and a retired couple seated by the window inside slowed their conversation, eyes tracking the scene like it was something they'd seen before but never up this close. Darius exhaled slowly, not frustrated, not embarrassed, just familiar, because this wasn't new, not the tone, not the assumption, not the quiet shift in atmosphere that said he didn't quite fit the frame they had in mind, and for a split second, something flickered behind his eyes, not anger, not yet, but memory, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just settles in your chest like it's always been there. But he didn't reach for it, didn't lean into it, instead he stayed present, grounded, and said again, "Run it again," and this time, there was something different in his voice, not louder, not sharper, just certain, like he wasn't asking for permission. Gregory let out a short breath through his nose, a restrained sigh that carried just enough irritation to signal he was done entertaining this. "Sir, we have standards here," he said, the phrase hanging in the air longer than it should have, heavier than it sounded, and a few feet away, the young attendant shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two men as if unsure which version of reality to align with, because something about the way Darius stood there, unmoved, unhurried, didn't match the script Gregory was following, and that mismatch was beginning to draw attention, the kind that spreads quietly but quickly in places built on control. "If you're here for maintenance or delivery, you need to check in through the service entrance," Gregory added, a slight tilt of his head toward the side path that curved behind the clubhouse, and there it was, subtle but unmistakable, the assumption fully formed now, no longer hidden behind procedure, and Darius heard it, absorbed it, let it pass through without visible reaction, because reacting too soon would give the moment what it wanted: chaos, escalation, noise, and he wasn't here for any of that. He reached into his pocket, not hurriedly, just deliberately, and pulled out his phone, not to show proof, not to argue, but to tap a single contact, his thumb hovering for just a second before pressing down. And as the line began to ring, somewhere beneath the polished surface of Silver Ridge Golf Club, something unseen had already started to move, but up here, in the sunlight, with eyes watching and assumptions settling into place, it still looked like a simple misunderstanding waiting to be resolved, and that was exactly what made it dangerous. The call did not ring long, barely a second before a voice answered on the other end, calm, precise, and already alert as if it had been waiting. "This is Evelyn," she said, her tone clipped in that way only people who operate behind power structures learn over time, efficient, controlled, and never surprised, and Darius did not raise the phone high or step away. He kept it at his side, his voice low enough that it did not disrupt the surface of the moment but steady enough to carry authority. "Through the line, run a live ownership audit on Silver Ridge Golf Club," he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle into the system he had just activated, "and flag any active staff under member services." There was no hesitation on the other end, just a soft click of keys already in motion. "Understood, initiating now," Evelyn replied, and while the exchange lasted no more than a few seconds, something about it shifted the air around him, not visibly, not yet, but in the way a storm begins miles before anyone hears thunder. Gregory watched the interaction with a narrowed gaze, arms folding across his chest now, posture tightening as patience thinned into irritation. "Sir, I am going to ask you one more time to leave the entrance," he said, each word slightly firmer than the last, like he was reinforcing a boundary he believed was already established. And still, Darius did not move, did not raise his voice, did not offer explanation. Instead he looked past Gregory for a moment, through the glass doors into the clubhouse where polished wood reflected the morning light and a cluster of members laughed over coffee as if nothing outside their circle could possibly matter, and that contrast, that quiet separation between who belonged and who did not, sat heavy in the space between them. "You might want to hold that request," Darius said, his voice even, almost conversational, and for the first time, Gregory's confidence faltered just enough to register, not in his words but in the slight pause before his response. "Excuse me," he said, and now there was something else there, something closer to defensiveness than authority, because the script was no longer unfolding the way he expected. Nearby, the young golfer with the phone shifted his weight, angling slightly to capture a better view, not openly recording, not yet, but close enough that the lens was ready if something crossed the invisible line between private discomfort and public spectacle. And inside, the attendant at the desk glanced down at the screen in front of her, fingers hovering above the keyboard as if unsure whether to follow protocol or instinct, because something about this interaction felt unresolved in a way that could not be dismissed with a simple instruction to leave. "We have a system for a reason," Gregory continued, trying to reassert control, "and right now, that system says you are not authorized to be here." The words were clean, practiced, the kind that carried institutional weight, but they did not land the same way anymore, not after the call, not after the subtle shift that had begun to ripple beneath the surface. Darius nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, like he had heard this exact line before, in different rooms, from different people, always delivered with the same certainty, and then he said, "Systems only work when they are accurate." And the sentence hung there, simple and direct, yet it pressed against the edges of the moment in a way that made it harder to ignore. Gregory let out a short laugh, not amused, more dismissive than anything else. "Our system is very accurate," he replied, but even as he said it, his eyes flicked briefly toward the desk inside, just a glance, quick and almost involuntary, but enough to reveal a crack in the certainty he was projecting, and that was all it took for the tension to deepen, because doubt, once introduced, does not stay quiet. It spreads, subtle at first, then louder with every unanswered question. The retired couple by the window had stopped pretending not to watch, their conversation fully paused now as they leaned slightly closer to the glass, and the young attendant finally looked back up at Gregory, her expression no longer neutral. "Do you want me to run it again?" she asked, her voice careful, measured, but carrying a weight that suggested she already knew the answer might not come back the same. Gregory hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but in a place like this, where confidence is currency, even a fraction is noticeable. "There is no need," he said quickly, too quickly, and that was when the phone in Darius's hand vibrated once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but in that moment, it might as well have been a signal flare. He lifted it slightly, not dramatically, just enough to hear, "It is live." Evelyn's voice came through, quieter now but sharper, "Ownership structure confirmed, board access synchronized, and there is something you should know." Darius's eyes did not leave Gregory as he responded, "Go ahead," and on the other end, there was a brief pause, the kind that does not come from hesitation but from precision. "The club's majority controlling interest shifted 3 weeks ago," she said, each word deliberate, "and the update was not distributed to member services." And that was the moment everything began to tilt, not visibly, not yet, but enough that the foundation Gregory had been standing on no longer felt as solid as it did a minute ago, because information, when withheld or ignored, has a way of catching up at the exact moment it is least convenient, and Darius let that sit for just a second before he spoke again, his voice still calm, still measured, but now carrying something else beneath it, something quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous than volume. "Then it sounds like your system is about to correct itself." Gregory did not respond immediately, and that silence, small as it was, stretched longer than anything he had said so far, because it was no longer just a matter of policy or presence, it was uncertainty, and uncertainty did not belong at the entrance of a place like this, not where everything was supposed to be controlled, predictable, curated down to the smallest detail. His eyes shifted again toward the reception desk, this time not as a reflex but with intention, as if searching for confirmation that the world still worked the way he believed it did, but the young attendant was already moving, fingers now actively scanning through the system, her posture leaning forward, focused, and for the first time since this began, the rhythm of the room changed, the low hum of quiet conversations inside the clubhouse softened further, replaced by a subtle awareness that something was unfolding just beyond the glass, something that no longer fit neatly into the usual categories of inconvenience or misunderstanding. "What did you just say?" Gregory asked finally, his voice lower now, less performative, more cautious, and Darius did not rush to answer. He let the question sit for a second, not to create tension but because it already existed, fully formed between them. "I said your system is about to correct itself," he repeated, just as calmly as before, and the words did not escalate the situation, they clarified it. And that clarity was what made Gregory shift his weight slightly, the first physical sign that the ground beneath him was not as stable as it had been moments ago. Behind him, the attendant's screen refreshed with a soft flicker, and her expression changed almost instantly, not dramatically, not exaggerated, but enough that anyone watching closely could see it, her eyes widening just a fraction, her lips parting as if she had expected one result and received another entirely. She glanced up, first at Gregory, then at Darius, then back to the screen as if confirming what she was seeing was real. "Sir," she said carefully, her voice no longer neutral, "there is an update in the system." Gregory turned halfway toward her, irritation and curiosity colliding in his posture. "What kind of update?" he asked, and now there was an edge to his tone, not aggressive, but sharpened by the fact that control was beginning to slip in ways he could not yet define. The attendant hesitated, not because she did not understand what she was seeing, but because she did, and that understanding carried weight. "It looks like the ownership records were revised," she said slowly, choosing each word as if it might change the outcome depending on how it was delivered, and the moment she said it, something in the air shifted again, deeper this time, because ownership was not a small detail, it was the foundation everything else rested on. Gregory frowned, a real one now, not the controlled expressions he had been using before. "Revised how?" he pressed, stepping closer to the desk, and as he did, 2 members walking out of the clubhouse slowed their pace, not stopping, not openly staring, but close enough to hear, because moments like this, when structure begins to crack, draw attention in ways that nothing else can. The attendant swallowed lightly, then turned the screen slightly so Gregory could see. "There is a new controlling stakeholder listed," she said, and even from a few feet away, the change was visible in Gregory's posture, the slight tightening of his shoulders, the way his head tilted just enough to read more carefully, and for a second, he did not speak at all, because what he was looking at did not align with what he believed to be true, and belief, when challenged by evidence, does not collapse immediately, it resists, it searches for error, for misinterpretation, for anything that can restore the original narrative. this has to be a system delay, he said finally, more to himself than anyone else, but the certainty was no longer there, it was thinner now, stretched, and Darius watched all of it without interruption, without commentary, because this part did not require him to speak, the system was doing that for him, and systems, when they reveal truth, do not argue, they simply display it. There is a timestamp, the attendant added quietly, 3 weeks ago, and that detail landed heavier than the rest, because it meant this was not new, not sudden, not an error that had just occurred, it had been there, sitting quietly in the background, waiting to be acknowledged, and Gregory's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in the realization that something important had been missed, something that now stood directly in front of him, composed, patient, and completely unaffected by the authority he had tried to assert just minutes earlier. The young golfer outside finally raised his phone fully now, not hiding it anymore, because the moment had crossed that invisible threshold, it was no longer private, no longer contained, it was unfolding in real time, and people could feel it, the shift, the unraveling, the quiet turning of something that had been firmly one way now beginning to move in another direction. Gregory straightened slightly, trying to regain control, to reposition himself within a narrative that was slipping away. Even if that is true, he said, turning back toward Darius, that does not automatically grant access without proper verification, and it was a good line, structured, procedural, the kind that usually held ground, but this time, it sounded different, because the foundation it relied on had already been questioned, and Darius tilted his head just slightly, not dismissive, not confrontational, just acknowledging the effort. Then verify it, he said, and there was no challenge in his tone, no threat, just an invitation, simple and direct, and that was what made it impossible to ignore, because refusing now would not reinforce authority, it would expose it, and Gregory knew that, even if he did not fully understand why yet. The attendant looked between them again, waiting, the system open, the information visible, the truth no longer hidden behind assumption or routine, and for the first time since this began, the question was no longer whether Darius belonged there, but whether the people deciding that had been wrong all along. Gregory did not move right away, and that hesitation, subtle but unmistakable, lingered longer than anything else that had happened so far, because in a place built on certainty, even a moment of doubt could feel like a disruption. His eyes remained fixed on the screen for a second longer before shifting back to Darius, and this time there was no immediate dismissal, no quick instruction to leave, just a recalibration happening in real time. All right, he said finally, his voice lower now. Controlled but no longer absolute, we will verify it, and as soon as the words left his mouth, the balance of the situation shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that everyone present could feel, because verification meant acknowledgement, and acknowledgement meant that what had been dismissed minutes ago was now being taken seriously. The attendant nodded quickly, already moving through additional layers of the system, her fingers more deliberate now, more careful, as if every click carried weight beyond routine procedure, and behind her, another staff member who had been quietly organizing paperwork paused, glancing over with a look that was no longer casual curiosity, but focused attention, the kind that appears when something begins to matter beyond the surface. Pull up the executive registry, Gregory added, stepping closer, his tone returning to structure, but not quite to authority, not yet, because authority without certainty does not land the same way. The attendant complied, navigating through menus that most people in the room had never seen, deeper layers of access that were not part of daily operations, and as the screen loaded, the seconds stretched, not because they were long, but because everyone was now aware of them, aware that whatever appeared next would not just resolve the moment, it would define it. Darius stood exactly where he had been, unchanged, his posture steady, his expression unreadable, and that stillness had become its own kind of presence, not passive, not defensive, but anchored, as if he had already moved beyond this moment and was simply allowing it to catch up to him. Outside, the young golfer shifted his phone slightly higher, no longer pretending to check messages, now clearly recording, and no one stopped him, because attention had fully turned inward, toward the screen, toward the unfolding verification that had replaced assumption. It is loading, the attendant said softly, almost to herself, and Gregory leaned in just enough to see, his jaw set, not tense, but focused, and for a brief second, no one spoke. Not the members walking past, not the staff inside, not even the faint Conversations that usually filled the clubhouse, because silence, when shared by a group, carries its own kind of weight, and then the screen refreshed, clean and immediate, and the change was visible, not in flashing alerts or dramatic signals, but in the quiet precision of updated information, a new entry, positioned at the top where it could not be overlooked, and the attendant's breath caught just slightly, not loudly, but enough that Gregory heard it. "What is it?" he asked, his voice controlled but edged with something new, something closer to concern than command. The attendant swallowed, her eyes scanning the line again as if confirming it had not changed in the last second. "Primary controlling stakeholder," she read, her voice careful, deliberate, and then she paused, not because she did not know what came next, but because saying it would change everything. Gregory's gaze sharpened. "Go on," he said, and there was no impatience now, just the need for clarity, and the attendant looked up, directly at him, before finishing the line. "Darius Cole," she said, and the name settled into the space between them, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a weight that did not require volume, because recognition does not need to be announced, it simply arrives, and in that moment, Gregory's posture shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to register. The slight straightening of his back, the adjustment of his stance, the recalculation of where he stood in relation to the man in front of him, and for a second, he did not speak, because the structure he had been relying on had just redefined itself, and it did so without asking for permission. The attendant continued, almost automatically now, as if reading through the rest of the details was the only way to process what had just appeared. 42% controlling interest, executive override access, board level clearance, each phrase adding another layer, another confirmation, another piece of a reality that had been present all along but unrecognized. And behind the glass, the retired couple leaned forward slightly, not trying to hide it anymore, while the young golfer outside lowered his phone just a fraction, not because the moment was over, but because it had shifted into something more serious, something that demanded attention rather than spectacle. Gregory exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes when a situation moves beyond expectation and into consequence, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different, not weaker, not uncertain, but recalibrated, aligned with the new information in front of him. "Mr. Cole," he said, the name now carrying a different weight than it would have minutes ago, "it appears there has been an oversight," and the word hung there, carefully chosen, because it allowed for adjustment without fully admitting fault. But even as he said it, the shift was clear. The authority he had tried to enforce earlier had been replaced by something else, something more cautious, more aware, and Darius let the moment settle before responding, not rushing, not pressing, just allowing the truth to stand on its own. And when he did speak, his voice remained calm, unchanged, but now it carried the quiet certainty of someone who had never needed the system to validate him, only to reveal itself. "Oversight," he repeated, almost thoughtfully, as if considering the word itself, and then he looked directly at Gregory. "Not confrontational, not aggressive, just clear, or pattern," he said, and the difference between the two lingered in the air, heavier than anything that had come before, because one was accidental, and the other was not. And for the first time since this began, Gregory did not have an immediate response, because this was no longer about access, or protocol, or even verification. It was about what had been assumed, what had been enforced, and what that said about the system itself, now fully visible in the morning light. The word lingered longer than anything else that morning. Pattern, not loud, not accusatory, but precise in a way that left no room for easy dismissal, and Gregory felt it, not as an attack, but as something heavier, something that could not be smoothed over with policy or phrasing. His jaw tightened slightly, not in defiance, but in recognition that the moment had shifted beyond recovery. And for the first time since Darius had stepped onto the stone entryway, Gregory did not look like the man in control of the situation. He looked like someone recalculating in real time, trying to find solid ground where there was none. "Mr. Cole," he began again, his tone now measured in a different way, less performative, more deliberate. "If there has been any misunderstanding, we can address it immediately," and the sentence was structured carefully, built to contain the situation, to reduce it to something manageable, something procedural. But the space around them no longer responded to that kind of framing, because too much had already been revealed. The attendant stood still behind the desk, hands resting lightly on the edge, eyes no longer flicking between them but fixed on Darius now, not out of curiosity, but out of awareness, the kind that comes when someone realizes they are witnessing something that will not be undone once it finishes unfolding. Outside, the young golfer lowered his phone slightly, not stopping the recording, but adjusting his posture, because the energy had changed. It was no longer about catching a moment, it was about understanding it, and inside, the quiet conversations had faded completely, replaced by a stillness that carried attention without needing to demand it. Darius did not respond immediately, not because he was considering Gregory's words, but because the moment did not require urgency, it required clarity, and when he finally spoke, his voice was the same as it had been from the beginning, calm, even, controlled. "You already addressed it," he said, and the simplicity of the statement landed harder than anything louder would have, because it did not argue, it concluded. Gregory blinked once, a small, involuntary reaction, as if the timeline he had been operating under had just been cut short. "That was before we had complete information," he replied, and there was a hint of defense now. Subtle, but present, because acknowledging fault without losing authority is a balance few people manage well, and he was trying to find it in real time. Darius nodded slightly, acknowledging the effort without validating it. "The information was always there," he said, "you just chose when it mattered," and that line settled into the space with a weight that could not be redirected, because it shifted the focus away from systems and onto decisions, and decisions carry responsibility in a way systems do not. The attendant lowered her gaze briefly, not out of guilt, but out of recognition, because she had seen the hesitation earlier, she had felt it, the moment when the system could have been checked again and was not, and now that moment stood exposed, no longer hidden behind routine. Gregory inhaled slowly, his shoulders rising just slightly before settling again, and when he spoke this time, there was less structure, less control, more reality. "What would you like us to do?" he asked, and the question, simple as it was, marked a complete shift from where they had started, because it no longer assumed authority, it deferred to it, and that change did not go unnoticed, not by the staff, not by the members watching, not by the quiet weight of the room itself. Darius looked at him for a second, not assessing, not judging, just observing, as if measuring not the words, but the understanding behind them, and then he glanced past Gregory, into the clubhouse, where everything still looked the same, the polished wood, the carefully arranged seating, the curated calm, and for a brief moment, something flickered behind his eyes again, not anger, not satisfaction, but memory, quiet and sharp. He was 19, standing outside another club, not this one, but close enough in structure that the difference did not matter, wearing a borrowed collared shirt, holding a resume that no one would read, being told politely that membership was full, that access required referrals, that maybe he should try again next season, and he had nodded then, just like he had nodded now, not because he accepted it, but because he understood it, understood that the door was not closed because of timing or paperwork, but because of perception, and that perception had followed him into rooms, into deals, into spaces that claimed to be neutral but were not, and now, standing here, with the system open, the truth visible, and the same pattern repeating in a different form, the memory did not sting, it clarified, and he returned his focus to Gregory, his voice steady, unchanged. "You do not need to fix this for me," he said, and there was no arrogance in it, no dismissal, just fact. "You need to understand it," and the difference between those two things settled heavily into the moment. Because fixing implies a single action, a correction, something that can be completed and moved past, but understanding requires something else entirely, something slower, deeper, and far less comfortable. Gregory held his gaze for a second, then nodded once, not fully, not confidently, but enough to show that the shift had registered, even if it had not fully landed yet, and behind him, the attendant straightened slightly, as if preparing for whatever came next, because the moment was not over. It had only changed direction, and everyone there could feel it, the quiet turning of something larger than a single interaction, something that had been exposed not through confrontation, but through presence, patience, and the simple act of not leaving when told to. Understanding did not arrive all at once, it settled slowly, like weight being placed carefully onto something that had never been tested before, and Gregory felt it in the way the space around him no longer responded to his cues, no longer adjusted to his tone, because the center of control had shifted without announcement, and now he was standing just outside of it, aware but not fully aligned. "I hear you," he said after a moment, and the words were quieter than anything he had said so far. Not rehearsed, not structured, just spoken, and for a brief second, they hung there without resistance, because this was the first time he had responded without trying to redirect. The moment, the attendant behind the desk glanced at him, then back at Darius, her posture straightening again, but this time it was not out of routine, it was out of awareness that something larger than procedure was now in motion, something that did not follow the usual hierarchy of staff and member, and outside, the young golfer lowered his phone slightly more, not ending the recording, but no longer holding it as if he were capturing something fleeting, because this was no longer fleeting. It was unfolding, steady and deliberate, and inside the clubhouse, a man near the window set his coffee down without taking a sip, his attention fixed entirely on the entrance, not out of curiosity, but because something about the stillness had become louder than any conversation could be. Darius remained exactly where he was, his presence unchanged, but the room had adjusted around him. And that adjustment was visible now, in the way Gregory's shoulders had lowered just slightly, in the way the attendant no longer avoided eye contact, in the way the silence felt intentional rather than accidental. There is a process for situations like this, Gregory continued, his voice regaining some structure, but not authority, not yet. We can escalate this internally, review the interaction, make sure it does not happen again, and it was a reasonable offer, measured, procedural, the kind that usually resolved issues before they became something more, but Darius did not respond immediately. Because the moment had already moved past resolution, it was now about recognition, and recognition cannot be expedited, it cannot be processed through forms or escalations, it has to be seen, fully and without adjustment, and when he spoke, his tone remained steady, but the words carried a different weight now, not corrective, not reactive, but declarative. It already happened, he said, and the simplicity of it removed any illusion that the moment could be undone. Gregory nodded slowly, absorbing that, not resisting it this time, just acknowledging it as fact, and for a second, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to clarify, only something left to decide. The attendant glanced back at the screen, then at Gregory again, as if waiting for direction, but the direction was no longer his to give in the same way. That much was clear now, and it showed in the way he hesitated, not out of confusion, but out of awareness that the next step would not follow the pattern he was used to. Darius shifted his weight slightly, not moving away, not stepping forward, just adjusting enough to signal that he was still present, still engaged, and then his phone vibrated again, a quiet interruption that did not break the moment but added to it. He lifted it just enough to hear, "We have full access across the club systems." Evelyn's voice came through, steady as before, security logs, staff records, member services reports, everything is synchronized. And Darius listened without reacting outwardly, because the information was not surprising, it was expected. There is also a pattern in prior complaints, she continued, her tone precise. Similar incidents flagged but never escalated beyond internal notes, and that line settled into the moment with a different kind of weight, not immediate, not visible, but deeper, because it confirmed what had already been suggested, what had already been felt, that this was not isolated, not random, not an oversight that existed in a vacuum. And Darius closed his eyes for just a fraction of a second, not in frustration, not in anger, but in recognition, the kind that comes when something you already understood is confirmed in a way that removes any remaining doubt. He lowered the phone slightly, his gaze returning to Gregory, who was watching him now with a different kind of attention, not defensive, not dismissive, but cautious. Aware that the situation had expanded beyond what was visible in the room. "You mentioned a process," Darius said, his voice calm, unchanged, and Gregory nodded once. "Yes," he replied, and there was no hesitation in the answer, just readiness, because this was familiar ground, procedural ground. "Good," Darius continued, and for the first time, there was a slight shift in his tone, not louder, not sharper, but more defined, more directed. "Then let us follow it," and the words did not escalate. The moment, they clarified the next step. But the difference now was that the process would not be used to contain the situation, it would be used to expose it, and Gregory understood that, even if he did not fully grasp the extent of it yet, because the authority behind those words did not come from position or tone, it came from something else entirely, something that had been present from the beginning, steady, patient, and now fully visible. And for the first time since this began, the system that had been used to deny access was about to be used to reveal everything it had tried to hide. Gregory nodded once more, but this time it was not a gesture of control, it was acceptance of a direction he no longer fully dictated, and that distinction settled quietly into the space between them as he turned slightly toward the attendant. "Pull the internal incident logs," he said, his voice steady but no longer leading the moment, instead following it, and the attendant moved immediately, fingers returning to the keyboard with a new kind of urgency, not rushed, not panicked, but aware. That every action now carried visibility beyond her screen. The system responded quickly, layers opening that were not part of daily workflow, records surfacing that had been archived, categorized, and quietly left untouched, and as the first entries appeared, the air shifted again, not sharply, but with a deeper weight, because this was no longer about one interaction at the entrance. It was about everything that had been recorded and never fully addressed. "There are multiple entries," the attendant said, her voice careful, almost hesitant, as if reading them aloud would give them more presence than they had ever been allowed before. Gregory stepped closer, eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the screen, and for the first time, there was no attempt to reinterpret what he was seeing, no quick explanation, no immediate defense, just recognition, because the pattern was no longer abstract, it was documented, time-stamped, categorized, and quietly dismissed. "Guest access concern. Flagged but unresolved." The attendant read from one entry, then another, "VIP denial dispute, noted, no escalation," and then another, each line similar in structure, different in detail, but consistent in outcome, and that consistency was what made it undeniable. Outside, the young golfer shifted his stance again, lowering his phone just slightly, not out of disinterest, but because the moment had moved beyond spectacle into something heavier, something that demanded attention rather than reaction. Inside, the man by the window leaned back slowly, his expression no longer neutral, his attention fixed, because what was unfolding now was not just a moment of tension, it was a revelation of something that had been quietly operating beneath the surface. Darius stood still, listening, not interrupting, not reacting outwardly. Because this was not new to him, not in experience, not in understanding, but hearing it laid out, documented, confirmed in the very system that had just tried to deny him, gave it a different weight, not emotional, but structural, and that distinction mattered. Gregory exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly as he absorbed the information, and when he spoke, his voice had changed again, not just in tone, but in intention. "Why were these not escalated?" he asked, not to challenge, but to understand, and the question, simple as it was, carried more weight than anything he had said earlier, because it acknowledged that something had been missed, not just once, but repeatedly. The attendant hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because saying it out loud would remove any remaining distance between what was recorded and what was real. "They were marked as non-critical," she said finally, her voice quiet, and the phrase landed with a kind of finality. Because it explained everything without justifying anything. Non-critical, meaning not urgent, not important enough to disrupt the system, not significant enough to require change, and that classification now stood exposed, not as a neutral decision, but as a pattern of dismissal. Gregory closed his eyes for a brief second, not in frustration, not in denial, but in recognition, because the system he had trusted, the process he had enforced, had not failed in a dramatic way, it had failed. Quietly, consistently, and that kind of failure is harder to see, harder to correct, and far more difficult to defend. Darius finally shifted his gaze slightly, looking past the screen, past Gregory, into the space where members moved as if nothing had changed, and in a way, they had not yet, but the foundation beneath them had begun to move, slowly, deliberately, and that movement would not stop once it started. "This is the process," Darius said, his voice calm, unchanged, and Gregory looked at him, understanding now that the process he had referred to earlier was not about resolution, it was about exposure, about bringing into view what had been allowed to remain unseen. "Yes," Gregory replied, and there was no hesitation in the answer this time, just acknowledgement, and Darius nodded once, not approving, not dismissing, just confirming that they were now aligned on something, even if they had arrived there from very different positions. The attendant continued scrolling, each new entry reinforcing the same pattern, the same language, the same outcome, and with each one, the room grew quieter, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be understood was already visible, and for the first time since this began, the question was no longer whether Darius belonged in that space, It was whether the space itself had been operating under assumptions it could no longer sustain, and that realization did not arrive with noise or confrontation, it arrived the way most truths do, quietly, steadily, and impossible to ignore once seen. The silence that followed was no longer passive, it was deliberate, heavy in a way that pressed against every polished surface of the clubhouse, and for a brief moment, even the distant hum of golf carts outside seemed to fade into the background as if the entire space had narrowed its focus to a single point, the screen, the records, the truth that had been sitting there all along waiting for someone to look closely enough. Gregory did not speak right away, his eyes still fixed on the entries. Scrolling past, each one reinforcing what could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, and when he finally looked up, his expression had changed again, not dramatically, but enough to signal that something deeper had settled in, something that could not be undone with a simple correction or apology. "How many of these are there?" he asked quietly, and the attendant hesitated before answering, not because she did not know, but because saying the number would give the pattern a scale that could not be ignored. "More than a dozen in the last year," she said, her voice steady but lower than before, and that number did not sound large at first, not in a place that handled thousands of interactions, but it was not the quantity that mattered, it was the consistency, the repetition of the same kind of incident, handled the same way, and left unresolved in the same quiet manner. Darius listened without interruption, his gaze steady, not fixed on the screen anymore, but on Gregory, because the information had already done its work. It was no longer about what was written, it was about what was understood, and Gregory felt that shift, felt the weight of being seen not just in this moment, but as part of something larger, something that had been allowed to continue without challenge. "These were all reviewed?" Gregory asked, and the attendant nodded, "Yes, but they were categorized as non-critical and closed without escalation," she replied, repeating the phrase that had already begun to lose its neutrality, because now it carried implication, and Gregory let out a slow breath, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the desk as if grounding himself in something stable, because the structure he had relied on was no longer holding in the way it used to, and for a second, he said nothing, because there was nothing left to reinterpret, no angle left to adjust, only the reality in front of him, and behind him, the man by the window stood up slowly, not abruptly, not making a scene, just moving closer to the glass as if proximity might offer a clearer understanding of what was unfolding, and outside, the young golfer finally lowered his phone completely, not ending the recording, but no longer holding it up, because the moment had shifted again, away from documentation and into reflection. Darius shifted his gaze slightly, taking in the room, the people, the quiet awareness that had replaced casual indifference, and for a brief second, the past brushed against the present again, not sharply, not painfully, but clearly. He was 22, sitting across from a client who had smiled politely while questioning every number he presented, not because the numbers were wrong, but because the person presenting them did not match the expectation of who should be sitting in that chair, and he had learned then what he was seeing now, that doubt does not always arrive loudly, it often comes wrapped in professionalism, in policy, in language that sounds neutral but carries weight beneath it, and that understanding had shaped the way he moved through every room after that, not reacting, not explaining, just observing until the truth revealed itself. And now, standing here, watching Gregory process what had been uncovered, that same understanding settled in again, not as something new, but as something confirmed. "You said this was non-critical," Darius said finally, his voice calm, but the words precise, and Gregory looked at him, not defensive, not dismissive, but aware that the question was not about classification anymore, it was about consequence. "That is how it was categorized," Gregory replied, and there was no attempt to soften it, no attempt to redirect, just acknowledgement, and Darius nodded once, slowly, as if placing that information exactly where it belonged. "And how many of those people walked away thinking they were the problem?" he asked, and the question did not accuse, it did not raise in volume, but it shifted the focus entirely, from system to impact, from process to experience, and Gregory did not answer right away, because the answer was not in the system, it was in the silence that followed each of those entries, in the absence of escalation, in the quiet closing of something that should have been addressed, and that kind of answer does not come quickly, not when it requires more than acknowledgement. The attendant lowered her gaze again, not out of avoidance, but because the question reached beyond her role, beyond the screen. into something that could not be resolved with data alone, and the room remained still, not frozen, but attentive, as if waiting for something that could not be rushed. Darius held his gaze on Gregory for a moment longer, then shifted it slightly, not away, but enough to signal that the moment had reached a different stage, one that no longer required proof, because the proof had already done its work, and what remained now was not information, but decision, not about access, not about verification, but about what happens when a system finally sees itself clearly for the first time. The question did not demand an answer, it demanded recognition, and Gregory felt that immediately, not as pressure, but as something heavier, something that settled in the space between what had been done and what had been ignored. His gaze lowered briefly, not out of avoidance, but because the answer was no longer something he could define with policy or language, it existed in the absence of action. In the quiet way each of those entries had been closed, filed, and forgotten, and when he finally looked back up, there was no attempt to redirect, no effort to soften the moment. Too many, he said, and the words were simple, but they carried more weight than any detailed explanation could have, because they acknowledged not just the pattern, but the failure to see it sooner. The attendant shifted slightly behind the desk, her posture no longer that of someone waiting for instruction, but of someone witnessing something unfold that would change the way she understood her role. And inside the clubhouse, the man by the window stepped closer, now standing just behind the glass, not hiding his attention anymore, because what was happening had moved beyond a private exchange, it had become something that touched the structure of the place itself. Darius nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that the answer had been given. And for a brief moment, the room held that stillness again, not empty, but full of understanding that had not been present before. And then his phone vibrated once more, a quiet signal that did not interrupt the moment but extended it. He lifted it slightly, his voice low. "Go ahead," he said, and Evelyn's response came through immediately, precise as always. "We have completed the review of internal records and cross-referenced staff activity," she said. "The same names appear repeatedly in these incidents, including the current head of member services," and though she did not say the name, it did not need to be spoken, because Gregory heard it in the structure of the sentence, felt it in the way the information aligned with what had just been revealed on the screen, and for the first time since this began, the situation moved from observation to implication, not abstract, not systemic, but personal. And Gregory did not react outwardly, did not step back or raise his voice, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle tightening, a recognition that the pattern he had just acknowledged was not separate from him, it included him. Darius listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, because this was not about surprise, it was about confirmation, and confirmation, when it arrives, does not require reaction, it requires decision. There is also a compliance threshold triggered. Evelyn continued, based on frequency and lack of escalation, this qualifies for immediate executive review under protocol, and the word protocol settled into the moment with a different kind of weight than before, not procedural, not routine, but definitive, because it marked a point where observation became action. And Darius lowered the phone slightly, his gaze returning to Gregory, who was watching him now with full awareness, not defensive, not dismissive, but understanding that whatever came next would not be contained within the usual boundaries. "You said there is a process," Darius said, his voice calm, unchanged, but now carrying a clarity that did not leave room for misinterpretation. And Gregory nodded once, slower this time, because the meaning of that word had changed since he first used it. "Yes," he replied, and there was no hesitation, only acknowledgement. And Darius held his gaze for a second, then spoke again. "Then we follow it completely." And the emphasis was not on the word follow, but on completely, because partial action had already been shown to be insufficient, and Gregory understood that, not intellectually, but fully, in the way someone understands something that cannot be undone. The attendant glanced between them, her eyes widening slightly as the weight of what was about to happen settled in, because this was no longer about correcting a moment, it was about addressing a pattern that had been allowed to exist, and that kind of action does not remain contained. It moves outward, affecting everything it touches. Darius lifted the phone again, his voice steady. "Initiate executive protocol," he said, and there was no pause, no hesitation, because the decision had already been made. "Authorize full review of member services operations, effective immediately." And on the other end, Evelyn responded without delay, confirmed, initiating now, and though nothing visible changed in that exact second, the shift was immediate, structural. Because once a system moves at that level, it does not stop at the surface, it goes deeper, and everyone in that space could feel it, not as noise, not as disruption, but as a quiet recalibration of authority. Gregory exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance, because the moment had moved beyond his control, and now his role was no longer to manage the situation, but to stand within it, to face what had been revealed, and to respond to what came next. The man by the window stepped back slightly, not retreating, but adjusting. As if giving space to something that had become larger than observation, and outside, the young golfer lowered his phone completely, no longer recording, because the moment had crossed into something that did not need to be captured to be understood. Darius remained still, his presence unchanged, but the room had shifted around him in a way that could not be reversed, and for the first time since this began, the system that had once denied him was now moving in alignment with him, not because it had been forced, but because it had finally been seen clearly enough to change. The confirmation did not come with noise, it came with movement, subtle at first but undeniable, the kind of shift that begins beneath the surface and rises slowly until everyone can feel it. The system had been activated, not in theory, not in discussion, but in real time, and that reality settled into the room with a quiet authority that no one could challenge. Gregory stood still for a moment longer, his gaze no longer searching for answers on the screen but fixed somewhere between acceptance and realization, because what had just been set in motion was no longer a conversation, it was a process that would not pause for interpretation. Understood, he said finally, his voice steady but stripped of the certainty it had carried earlier, not weaker, but clearer, aligned now with the situation rather than against it, and that alignment, small as it seemed, marked a turning point. Because it meant the resistance was gone, replaced by acknowledgement. The attendant behind the desk straightened fully, her posture no longer uncertain, her movements now guided by the same system that had just been activated, and as she refreshed the interface, a new layer appeared, not visible before, not part of the standard workflow, but now accessible, because the authority behind it had changed. Executive review in progress, she read quietly, and though the words were simple, they carried weight. Because they signaled that the situation had moved beyond the local level, beyond individual judgment, into something structured, something accountable, and that kind of shift does not go unnoticed. Inside the clubhouse, the man by the window stepped back slowly, not retreating, but adjusting to the realization that what he had been watching was no longer just an interaction, it was a turning point, something that would ripple beyond the walls of this place. And outside, the young golfer slipped his phone into his pocket, not because the moment had ended, but because it had become something that did not need to be recorded to be remembered. Darius remained where he was, his presence unchanged, his posture steady, but the room had adjusted fully around him now, not because he had demanded it, but because the truth had made it inevitable. His phone vibrated once more, and this time, when he lifted it, he did not step away, he did not lower his voice, because there was nothing left to contain. Status, he said, and Evelyn's response came through immediately, precise, controlled. All relevant departments have been notified, access privileges are being reviewed in real time, and administrative control over member services has been temporarily reassigned pending investigation, and each phrase added another layer to what had already begun, not escalating the moment, but solidifying it, turning what had been revealed into action. And Gregory listened, not interrupting, not reacting outwardly, because the process was no longer something he could influence, it was something he had to face. There will be a formal review of all prior incidents, Evelyn continued, and personnel directly involved in repeated complaints will be flagged for immediate evaluation, and though the words were delivered calmly, they carried consequence, not dramatic, not sudden, but structured, inevitable, and Gregory understood that, not as a threat, but as a result, the natural outcome of what had been uncovered. Darius lowered the phone slightly, his gaze returning to Gregory, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the situation no longer required explanation, it had moved beyond that, into something final, something that could not be undone with a single response. You asked what you should do, Darius said, his voice calm, unchanged, but now carrying a clarity that left no space for misinterpretation, and Gregory nodded once, slowly, because he remembered the question, and now he understood the answer. Yes, he replied, and there was no hesitation, only readiness, and Darius held his gaze for a second before continuing. "Now you follow through," he said, and the words did not command, they confirmed. Because the process had already begun, and Gregory's role in it was no longer to control it, but to stand within it, to accept what it revealed and respond accordingly, and that distinction mattered, because it marked the difference between authority and accountability. The attendant glanced at Gregory briefly, then back at the screen, her movement steady, focused, as the system continued to update in real time, each change reinforcing the shift that had already taken place, and the room, once defined by quiet exclusivity, now held a different kind of silence, one that was not built on separation, but on awareness, and that awareness spread, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, through every person present, because moments like this do not stay contained, they reshape the space around them. Darius took a slow breath, not out of relief, not out of tension, but as if marking the transition from one phase to another, and when he spoke again, his voice was as steady as it had been from the beginning. "This was never about access," he said, and Gregory listened fully now, because he understood that the moment had always been larger than that. It was about what happens when someone decides who belongs without checking why, and the sentence settled into the room with a finality that did not require emphasis, because it captured everything that had unfolded, not just in this moment, but in every entry on that screen, every interaction that had been dismissed, every decision that had been made without full awareness. And Gregory nodded once more, not out of agreement, but out of understanding, because the difference between those two things had become clear, and for the first time since this began, the room was no longer holding tension, it was holding truth, steady, visible, and impossible to ignore. The truth did not need to be repeated, it had already settled into every corner of the space, quiet but immovable, and what remained now was not discovery, but consequence, the kind that does not arrive with raised voices or sudden gestures, but with decisions that unfold in real time, steady and irreversible. Gregory stood facing Darius, his posture no longer defensive, no longer structured around control, but grounded in something else entirely, something closer to accountability, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the silence between them was no longer empty, it was complete. The attendant's screen updated again with a soft shift, and this time the changes were more visible, more immediate. "Access privileges updated," she read, her voice calm but carrying a new kind of awareness. "Member Services Administrative Control is now restricted pending executive review," and that line did not echo, but it landed, clearly, precisely, because it marked the beginning of visible change, not theoretical, not internal, but active. Gregory's eyes flicked briefly to the screen, then back to Darius, and in that glance, there was no confusion left, only understanding, because the process had moved beyond discussion into execution, and once that happens, there is no returning to the version of events that existed before. Inside the clubhouse, movement had slowed, conversations had not resumed, because the atmosphere had shifted in a way that could not be ignored. People were no longer pretending not to notice, they were watching, quietly, carefully, as the structure they trusted adjusted itself in real time, and that kind of adjustment draws attention. Not because it is loud, but because it is rare. Darius remained still, his presence unchanged, but the room had fully aligned around him now, not out of obligation, not out of recognition alone, but because the truth had made it unavoidable. His phone vibrated once more, and when he answered, his tone remained the same, calm, measured, consistent. "Proceed," he said, and Evelyn's voice came through, steady as always. "Personnel review has been initiated. All staff involved in flagged incidents are being placed under immediate evaluation, including current supervisory roles." And the phrasing was careful, precise, but the implication was clear, and Gregory heard it without needing clarification, because the process no longer operated at a distance, it had reached him directly. "Temporary reassignment of leadership responsibilities is also in effect until review completion," Evelyn continued, and this time, Gregory's shoulders shifted slightly, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who was not paying close attention, but enough to register the weight of what was happening, because this was no longer about the system correcting itself, it was about the system responding to him. Darius listened, then lowered the phone, his gaze steady, and for a moment, he said nothing, because the outcome did not require commentary, it required presence, and Gregory held that gaze, not challenging, not avoiding, just standing in it, because there was nowhere else to stand now. "You understand what this means," Darius said finally, his voice even, not accusatory, not harsh, but clear, and Gregory nodded once, slowly, because he did understand, not just the procedural meaning, but the broader one, the one that extended beyond his role, beyond his position, into the way decisions had been made and allowed to continue. "Yes," he replied, and there was no hesitation, no attempt to soften it, just acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement mattered, because it marked the difference between being confronted and being aware. The attendant glanced at Gregory briefly. Then back at the screen, her movement steady, professional, but there was something else there now, something quieter, an understanding that her role in the system carried more weight than she had realized before, because systems do not operate on their own, they are maintained, reinforced, and sometimes overlooked by the people within them, and that realization had settled in, not loudly, but deeply. Darius shifted his gaze slightly, looking past Gregory, into the clubhouse, where the environment remained visually unchanged, the same polished surfaces, the same carefully arranged order, but the meaning of that space had shifted, because once a system is seen clearly, it cannot return to being invisible. "This is where it changes," Darius said, not raising his voice, not emphasizing the words, but letting them stand as they were, and Gregory listened, fully now, because he understood that this was not a conclusion, it was a transition, "not just for me," Darius continued, "but for everyone who walked away before today thinking they did not belong," and the sentence did not accuse, it did not assign blame, but it reframed everything that had been revealed, placing it in a context that extended beyond a single moment, beyond a single interaction, into something broader, something that required more than correction, it required awareness, and Gregory nodded again, this time not just in acknowledgement, but in acceptance, because the shift had already begun, and resisting it was no longer possible. The man by the window stepped back slowly, returning to his table, not because the moment had ended, but because it had reached a point where observation was no longer needed, understanding had taken its place, and outside, the light remained unchanged, the same as it had been at the start of the morning, but the space beneath it had transformed, quietly, completely, and Darius stood at the center of it, not as someone who had forced change, but as someone who had revealed the need for it, and that distinction was what made the moment resonate, not as a disruption, but as a correction that had been waiting to happen. Change did not announce itself with a dramatic shift, it settled into place the way truth often does, quietly, firmly, and without asking for permission, and as the system continued to update in real time, the structure of Silver Ridge Golf Club adjusted beneath everyone present, not visibly in the architecture, not in the polished floors or the carefully maintained grounds, but in something less tangible and far more important, the way authority flowed, the way decisions were made, the way people were seen. The attendance screen refreshed again, and this time the changes were no longer subtle. "Leadership reassignment confirmed," she read, her voice steady but carrying the weight of what it meant. "Interim oversight transferred to executive operations pending final review," and though the phrasing remained professional, the implication was unmistakable. The authority Gregory had held just minutes ago was no longer active in the same way, not removed with force, not stripped in a moment, but restructured, repositioned within a system that had finally recognized the need to correct itself. Gregory stood still as the words settled, his posture composed, but no longer defined by control, because control had already shifted, and now what remained was how he would stand within that shift, not as the one directing it, but as the one accountable to it. And for a moment, he said nothing, because there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to reinterpret, only something to accept. Darius watched him, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because this moment was not about victory, it was about alignment, about bringing what had been hidden into full view and allowing the system to respond accordingly. His phone remained still in his hand now, no longer vibrating, no longer needing to, because everything that needed to be set in motion had already begun, and it would continue without further instruction. Inside the clubhouse, the stillness had shifted again, not tense, not uncertain, but reflective. Conversations had not resumed, but the silence no longer felt heavy, it felt aware, as if the space itself had recognized something it could not ignore. The man who had been standing by the window returned slowly to his seat, not turning away, but carrying the moment with him, and Outside, the morning continued as it always had, the sunlight steady, the course unchanged, but the meaning of the place had moved, quietly, permanently. There will be a formal statement issued. Evelyn's voice came through once more, not through the phone this time, but through the system itself. Her words relayed on the screen in front of the attendant. All members will be notified of policy revisions and updated review procedures. And that line extended the moment beyond the room. Beyond the people present, into something larger, something that would reach every part of the organization, because change at this level does not remain isolated, it expands, it integrates, it becomes part of the structure moving forward. Gregory nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging not just the action, but the necessity behind it, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, grounded, no longer carrying the edge of authority, but something more measured, more real. It should be, he said, and the words did not defend, did not justify, they accepted, and that acceptance mattered, because it marked the point where resistance ended and responsibility began. The attendant glanced at him briefly, then back at the screen, her expression no longer uncertain, because the direction was clear now, not from instruction, but from the system itself. And systems, when they align with truth, do not require interpretation, they simply move forward. Darius shifted his stance slightly, not preparing to leave, not yet, but acknowledging that the moment had reached its conclusion, not in the sense that it was over, but in the sense that it had completed its purpose. The truth had been revealed, the process had been activated, and the system had responded, and that sequence did not need to be repeated, it needed to be sustained. This is where it matters, Darius said, his voice calm, unchanged, but carrying a quiet finality, and Gregory looked at him, fully now, because he understood that what came next would define not just this moment, but everything that followed it. Not what you say after this, Darius continued, but what happens when no one is watching. And the sentence settled into the space with a depth that reached beyond the immediate situation, because it spoke to something larger, something that could not be measured by policy alone. And Gregory nodded again, more firmly this time, because the meaning was clear, not just intellectually, but fully. In the way someone understands something that will stay with them long after the moment ends. And for the first time since this began, there was no tension left in the room, no uncertainty, no imbalance, only clarity, steady and complete. And Darius took one final look around, not to confirm anything, not to assess, but to acknowledge the shift that had taken place, the quiet correction that had moved through the system and settled into something lasting. And then, without hurry, without announcement, he turned slightly toward the entrance, not as someone who had been denied, but as someone who had never needed permission to begin with. And in that movement, the moment closed, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with the kind of certainty that does not need to be explained to be understood. The door did not open with ceremony, it opened the same way it always had, quietly, smoothly, as if nothing had changed. And that was the final irony of the moment, because everything had changed, not in the hinges or the polished handles, but in the meaning of who walked through it and why. Darius stepped forward at a measured pace, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, the same way he had stood from the beginning. And this time, no one stopped him, no one questioned him, no one redirected him toward another entrance, because the question of access no longer existed. It had been replaced by something else entirely, something deeper, something that could not be undone by reversing a single action. Behind him, Gregory remained where he was, not frozen, not defeated, but still, absorbing the final shape of what had unfolded, because the moment had not taken anything from him that had not already been at risk. It had simply revealed it, and that distinction settled in slowly. The attendant watched as Darius passed through the threshold, her posture straight, her expression composed, but her understanding altered in a way that would not revert, because she had seen the system from both sides now, not just as a process, but as a reflection of choices. And that kind of awareness does not fade. Inside the clubhouse, the atmosphere shifted once more, not back to what it had been, but forward into something quieter, more deliberate. Conversations resumed, but they carried a different tone, less automatic, more aware, as if the space itself had been recalibrated, and everyone within it could feel the difference even if they could not fully explain it. Darius moved through the room without drawing attention, not because he needed to remain unseen, but because he no longer needed to be noticed. His presence had already done its work, not through force, not through volume, but through clarity. And that clarity lingered behind him like a quiet echo, not loud, not intrusive, but impossible to ignore. Near the window, the man who had been watching earlier lifted his coffee again, but this time he paused before taking a sip, his gaze following Darius for just a moment longer, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, because something about what he had just witnessed would stay with him, not as a story, but as a shift in perspective. Outside, the sunlight remained unchanged. The course stretched out in perfect symmetry, untouched by what had happened at the entrance, but even that felt different now, not in appearance, but in meaning, because spaces are defined not just by how they look, but by how they respond when challenged, and Silver Ridge had just been challenged in a way it could not ignore. Gregory finally turned, not toward the door, not toward the exit, but back toward the desk, his steps measured, his posture composed, and when he reached the attendant, he did not issue instructions. He did not attempt to reclaim authority, he simply looked at the screen again, the entries still visible, the pattern still present, and for a moment, he stood there, not as the one who had enforced the system, but as the one who now had to understand it, and that shift, quiet as it was, marked the true beginning of change, because acknowledgement without action fades, but acknowledgement followed by awareness has the potential to alter everything that comes after. The attendant met his gaze briefly, then returned to her work, not out of routine, but with a new sense of purpose, because the system she operated was no longer abstract, it had been revealed, and now it required something different from her, something more intentional, something more careful. Darius continued walking until he reached the far end of the clubhouse, where the view opened fully onto the course, wide and uninterrupted, the kind of view that had once been restricted, curated, protected by layers of access and assumption, and he stopped there for a moment, not to admire it, not to claim it, but simply to stand within it, because the point had never been to take anything, it had been to reveal what had always been his to access, and what had always been denied to others like him, and in that stillness, the past and present aligned, not in conflict, but in understanding. He did not need to look back to know what had changed behind him, he could feel it, not as a shift in power, but as a correction in perception, and that was what mattered, because power can be given or taken, but perception, once changed, alters everything it touches. He took a slow breath, steady and controlled, and then spoke quietly, not to anyone in particular, not to the room, not to the people who had watched, but as a statement that did not require an audience. I did not need to prove I belonged, he said, his voice calm, grounded. I needed the system to prove why it thought I did not, and the words settled into the space with a finality that did not need to be repeated, because they captured the entire moment in a way nothing else could, not as a victory, not as a confrontation, but as a revelation. And with that, he turned slightly, continuing forward, not looking back, not waiting for acknowledgement, because the change had already begun, and it would continue long after. He left, not because he forced it, but because he exposed what had been there all along, and once something like that is seen, it cannot be unseen, it can only be addressed, and that was the quiet power of the moment, not in what was said, not in what was done, but in what was finally understood.